Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into something a little more uncomfortable. Not armor though. Well, we'll get to that later. No, tonight we're going to lie down in the past. And what a strange past it was. Here's something you've probably never thought about in the Middle Ages. Night didn't flow like ours. It fractured. People didn't just lie down and wake up. They fell asleep, then they woke up in the middle of the night, did things, and then went back to sleep. A first sleep and a second sleep. The idea feels disjointed, yet once you notice it, you'll start to see echoes of it in everything. Like a shadow, your modern routine still drags behind it. It's not a horror story, but it's a little eerie how sleep once had two parts, and nobody thought that was strange. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your local time and where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun dips low, torches flicker, and you find yourself inside a thatched house or a stone castle, depending on your luck in the medieval lottery. It's night, officially, but nobody expects to sleep until morning. Not in one go. You lie down and slip into what's called first sleep primo somno in some old texts. It's the heavy, early kind of slumber, when your body crashes from hard labor or long prayer. The darkness wraps you, and for a few hours, your mind drifts. But then, like clockwork, around midnight, your eyes flutter open, not because you're restless. This is normal. The fire's still burning low, and others in the room are stirring too. This is what historians call segmented sleep. It wasn't rare, it was the standard across large swaths of Europe until the 17th century. And you just woke up in the middle of the night on purpose? Now here's the twist. This wasn't just a quick bathroom break or a shuffle to the kitchen. You were expected to be awake. This watch period between first and second sleep could last an hour or two, and people actually used it. You might pray, read scriptures if you were literate or lucky enough to own texts, mend clothing, talk softly with your partner, or just lie there, thinking. Sometimes people even visited neighbors. Not joking. They'd walk in the moonlight, knock on doors, and check in. Midnight social hour. Sleep researcher Roger E. Kirch unearthed hundreds of references to this phenomenon diaries, legal documents, even fictional tales where characters mention waking from their first sleep and preparing for their second, and no, it wasn't insomnia. It was a full-on routine. Doctors even prescribed rest between sleeps for mental clarity. In fact, some believe this window allowed the brain to process divine visions, or to be most fertile for, let's say, marital relations. Yes, in some manuals, mid-sleep intimacy was advised as the best time, because nothing says romance like waking up groggy, in the cold, and being told this is the holy hour to procreate. Your environment during this odd little intermission, dim, quiet, sometimes eerie. Candles were expensive, so you relied on embers or moonlight. Picture the amber flicker of coals casting shadows on rough wooden walls. The wool blankets scratchy. You hear the wind scratching the shutters. If you're in a rural village, animals grunt from their indoor stalls not separate from the house, and someone in the corner might be whispering a psalm while another empties a chamber pot just outside the door. A symphony of midnight domesticity. Why did this two-phase sleep pattern exist? The best guess is that it followed natural circadian rhythms in a world without artificial light. Once the sun went down, people went to bed early. After 4 or 5 hours, their internal clock nudged them awake. Instead of fighting it, society embraced it. There were prayers written specifically for the midnight wakeful hour. Monasteries scheduled their matins early morning prayer services around this rhythm. It wasn't weird. It was right. Of course, if you were a peasant, that midnight wakefulness wasn't always leisurely. You might check the coals to make sure they hadn't gone out. Fire was life, after all. Some villagers took this time to tend to small chores like repairing tools or spinning wool. Others prayed for the dead or for safety from the many things that like to sneak around at night. Bandits, spirits, bad dreams, or, if you believe the local folklore, the devil himself, slipping between barns in human skin. Historians still argue whether these wakeful hours bred more superstition or just reflected existing fears, but either way, People didn't like the dark. It had weight, shape, intention. And for the slightly wealthier, this period might be used for more refined pastimes like quiet reading or journaling. In fact, some of the earliest records of this sleep split come from personal diaries. A merchant might jot down worries about debts or reflect on a dream that felt ominous. These were moments of soft introspection. The darkness asked questions, and people, without distraction, answered them. In one 15th century English account, a widow wrote that she would often wake between sleeps and speak to God as if he were beside her bed. It's poetic, a little unsettling, and strangely intimate. Then, without fanfare, second sleep began. Your body knew. The fire's glow faded further. The night deepened. You lay back down, pulling your cloak tighter or shoving a sibling away. Because, let's be honest, space was a luxury and you drifted again. This second sleep was lighter, filled with dreams, and it would take you into dawn, or at least until the rooster decided everyone had suffered enough. Some researchers believe the death of segmented sleep came with industrialization. With gas lamps and rigid factory schedules, people pushed their bedtimes later and expected a straight 8 hours. No time to wake, reflect, or whisper. Just sleep and wake. Binary, efficient, but maybe a little hollow. Ironically, modern sleep disorders may stem from this shift. That middle of the night wakefulness you sometimes experience. It might not be dysfunction, it might be ancestral memory. Your body remembering a time when you were supposed to lie awake in the dark and listen to silence. So tonight, if you wake up at 2 a.m., don't panic. You're not broken. You're medieval. Just don't go knocking on your neighbor's door. They probably won't have any hot cider waiting. You try not to move too much as the straw beneath your back shifts and crunches like dry paper. The mattress isn't really a mattress, of course. It's a canvas sack stuffed with hay, sometimes feathers, if you're lucky. But usually hay. The Middle Ages didn't come with memory foam. And the thing is, this bed isn't just uncomfortable, it's alive. Not metaphorically, literally. There are bugs. You can't see them right now, but you can feel them just beneath the top layer of cloth. Little itches, pinches, fleas, lice, and mites were more faithful bedtime companions than any spouse. If you have a dog or cat curled up next to you, don't feel too safe, they brought friends. The word bedbug wasn't a warning, it was a guarantee. And yet, you still try to get comfortable, because this is just what sleeping feels like. Crunch, itch, scratch, breathe. If you're a peasant, you probably share this bed with more than just insects. Maybe a spouse, 3 children, a cousin, and one elderly aunt who mutters in her sleep. Personal space is theoretical. You lie there with your knees tucked to your chest, trying not to accidentally jab someone in the ribs with your elbow. If you roll over, you might crush a toddler. If you move too far sideways, you could fall into the fire pit. Yes, it's dangerously close. That's by design. There's no central heating, so you all huddle near the hearth, breathing in smoke and warmth in equal measure. If it gets too cold, some people literally bring the livestock inside. A pig by the fire is not unusual. It's insulation. Now, if you're a little wealthier, say a minor merchant or a skilled craftsman, you might have a real bed frame, wooden, carved, with some attempt at elegance. Maybe you even stuffed your mattress with feathers instead of straw, though that introduces its own problems. Feathers mold. They attract moisture. They stink after a while. And guess what? Mice love them. They nibble through the seams, nest inside, and multiply like mice. You start to understand why some nobles insisted on having servants fluff their bedding before sleep. Not for luxury, for pest control. Speaking of luxury, if you're really rich, like manor house rich, you sleep off the ground entirely. A bed raised high enough to avoid drafts, with steps leading up to it. The mattress is thicker, though still stuffed by hand. And yes, even royalty scratched. The castles were damp, the rooms drafty, and the canopies didn't keep out lice. In fact, some of the most elaborate beds were insect traps in disguise. The heavy curtains meant to block light and retain warmth also created the perfect breeding ground for creepy crawlies. Think of it as sleeping inside a fancy, bug-filled tent, and yet people didn't find this horrifying. This was just bedtime. If you lived long enough to worry about bed bugs, you were already ahead. Hygiene wasn't a consistent priority. Most people bathed infrequently, maybe once a week, sometimes once a season, depending on access to water and cultural norms. So your hair was greasy, your skin sweaty, and your bed an extension of your own. Fragrance. To freshen things up, people scattered herbs like lavender or wormwood between the straw. Some even tied bundles of dried flowers to the bedposts, not for decoration, for masking the smell. The term hitting the hay starts to make a lot more sense now. But here's a quirk you didn't expect: straw mattresses had to be regularly turned, literally flipped over or restuffed to prevent the buildup of moisture and mold. Every couple of months, you'd open the mattress, pull out the old straw, now darkened and musky, and replace it with fresh, dry stalks, a family chore, messy, smelly, necessary. In fact, the tradition of spring cleaning likely owes part of its origin to the seasonal changing of bedding. There's also the phenomenon of the bed rope. Beds weren't held together with nails or screws, they were lashed with ropes, woven in a grid beneath the mattress. Over time, the ropes would sag, so before bed, someone had to tighten them, pull the cords, check the knots. That's where the phrase sleep tight comes from. Not tight like cozy, tight like tensioned. Otherwise, you'd sink into the middle, wake up bent in ways your back wouldn't forgive. And no, you didn't get your own bed. Not unless you were unusually privileged or a monk in a well-funded monastery. Sharing a bed was economical, expected, and sometimes strategic. Travelers in inns often bunked together, complete strangers elbow to elbow. Entire families slept in one frame, sometimes even unrelated servants or apprentices. It saved space, conserved heat, and let's be honest, made nighttime burglary slightly less convenient. Would-be thieves had to step over multiple snoring bodies to get to your shoes. Of course, all this assumes you were sleeping indoors. But remember, many of the poorest laborers or seasonal workers didn't even have a bed to speak of. If you were transient, a shepherd, or living on the margins, sleep meant curling under a tree with a cloak pulled over your face, or tucking into a haystack in a barn, hoping the owner didn't chase you off. In some records, we even see references to entire families sleeping in abandoned churches or under bridges where the wind was blocked and the rain had to negotiate its entry. Now, back to the bugs. People had methods. Some slept with garlic under their pillows, hoping to ward off insects and spirits in equal measure. Others rubbed pig fat on their legs, not for beauty, but to discourage fleas from biting. If you were wealthy, you might commission a bed warmer, a metal pan filled with hot coals, swished between the sheets before you climbed in. Warmth, yes. Fire hazard, definitely. More than a few beds caught fire that way. But in winter, you took the risk. Let's talk textiles. Sheets were rare, linen was expensive, and cotton wasn't widely available in Europe until much later. Most people slept directly on the mattress or used coarse blankets made of wool. Not soft wool either. Itchy, thick, felted wool. The kind that left lines on your skin and smelled like a damp barn when wet. If you were lucky, you had more than one layer. If not, you curled into a ball and tried to think warm thoughts. Still, for all its discomfort, the bed was a place of ritual. People prayed before lying down, crossed themselves, recited rhymes. Some whispered protection spells. Some placed iron under the bed to keep away spirits. Children were told to sleep facing a particular direction or to avoid dreaming of witches because dreams were not entertainment. They were warnings, messages, or portals. And then there's the sleep position. Flat on your back was considered risky evil could enter through the mouth. Stomach sleeping sinful. Most people lay on their sides, often curled, hands folded under the head. This wasn't just comfort, it was etiquette. The wrong position could mark you as lazy, indulgent, or even morally suspect. Despite the dirt, the bugs, the cramped space, and the musty straw, sleep still found you. It always did, because your body had been working since dawn. You were exhausted, your fingers were calloused, your feet sore, and your belly, hopefully, full enough. You didn't expect comfort, you expected rest, and maybe, if you were lucky, a dream that didn't make you wake up screaming, "It's cold again tonight." And you're already regretting the way the wind finds every gap in the shutters. The fire has sunk into a dull orange sigh. Not quite dead, but not generous either. You stretch, then curl, then stretch again. But you can't get warm, not really. And then comes the nightly question, what are you wearing to bed? If you're modern, you might imagine some version of pajamas, maybe loose cotton or flannel. But in the medieval world, sleepwear was less a wardrobe choice and more a window into who you were, where you lived, and what you feared. There was no standard. In some households, people slept naked. In others, they kept on every layer they owned. And somewhere in between, a monk might be snoring in a tightly belted wool habit, while a nobleman adjusted the clasp of his ceremonial nightshirt, embroidered with family crests. You, on the other hand, are somewhere in the middle, probably wrapped in whatever tunic you wore during the day. Because laundry, let's be honest, is a once-a-week ordeal, at best. Sleeping naked wasn't always scandalous, but it was definitely situational. In warmer climates, it was common among peasants, who viewed it as practical. Clothes were precious, and sweating into them all night only meant more washing later. But it also made you vulnerable to cold, to vermin, and occasionally to accusations. If your house caught fire and you ran out unclothed, you might be suspected of immoral behavior. In the wrong setting, nudity wasn't just embarrassing, it was incriminating. There are court records of people being fined or shamed for indecent emergence during nighttime disturbances, the kind of thing you don't want to be remembered for in village gossip. Then there's the opposite extreme, full garb in bed. Some people wore their cloaks, shoes, and even belts to sleep, not because they were fashion conscious, but because they were cautious. Traveling merchants, soldiers on the road, or families living in unsafe districts sometimes went to bed prepared to run. If your town had a history of bandit raids, you didn't tuck into a nightgown. You cinched your boots. You kept a dagger under your blanket. And yes, if you were part of a feuding noble house, sleeping in partial armor wasn't unheard of. Not the full suit, no one's that dramatic, but a padded gambeson or chainmail vest, entirely possible. There are rumors, probably exaggerated, that certain knights in politically unstable regions never removed their armor at night for fear of assassination. Historians still argue whether these accounts are literal or symbolic exaggerations of paranoia. In monasteries, the rules got stricter and weirder. Some monastic orders dictated that monks sleep in their robes to avoid the temptations of the flesh. Even alone, in silence, under blankets, they were to remain clothed in the uniform of devotion. In certain abbeys, night inspections were conducted to ensure compliance. A monk caught without his habit might face penance, and if he snored too loudly, he might be moved to a more solitary cell, which sounds like a punishment. But let's be honest, after weeks of listening to Brother Giles wheeze like a bellows, solitude might be a mercy. Children, too, had peculiar routines. Depending on the household, they might be swaddled tightly in rough linen to keep them from scratching or wandering. Others were dressed in miniature versions of adult tunics. There's even evidence that, in some regions, children's nightwear was deliberately mismatched or patched with oddly colored scraps to confuse fairies or spirits who might want to steal them. The idea was that a sleeping child should be visually unappealing to the supernatural. Cute wasn't the goal. Safe was. And if that meant your child looked like a laundry accident, so be it. And let's not forget the symbolic power of clothes. In many households, what you wore to bed said something about how you viewed the night. If you believed sleep was a vulnerable state where the soul could wander, where demons could enter, you armored yourself accordingly. Wool against chill, crosses stitched into collars, amulets tied around necks. Some people wore little bags of salt in their sleeves. Others pinned herbs like sage or rue into their caps. Not for scent, for protection. There's an account from the 14th century describing a man who insisted on wearing his dead wife's shawl to sleep each night, not for comfort, but because he believed it shielded him from night terrors. And when it was stolen during a burglary, he didn't mourn the loss of the keepsake. He mourned the return of the dreams. For the aristocracy, of course, bedtime attire became another performance. Lavish robes of velvet or silk, embroidered with thread of gold, lined with fur. These were nightclothes designed not for comfort, but for being seen should an important guest arrive unexpectedly or a servant walk in bearing wine. In some regions, wealthy men held late meetings in bedchambers, reclining on cushions while discussing property disputes or marriage contracts. You didn't want to be caught underdressed, which meant that your nightshirt might be worth more than the cow tied up outside. Odd, considering it still let fleas climb in. Then there were the sleepers who layered up, not for fashion or fear, but for heat. Winters in Northern Europe were brutal, and fireplaces weren't always generous, so you piled on everything you owned. Undergarments, surcoat, even outer cloak. If it was cloth, and you weren't walking in it, you were sleeping in it. There are reports of people waking up with frozen water jugs beside them. In those conditions, a fur-lined hood at bedtime isn't indulgent, it's survival. And while it might sound ridiculous now, the sight of someone going to bed looking like they were headed into a snowstorm was just normal. You'd do it too. If you didn't want frostbite in your toes, let's not forget the bed caps. You've seen them in paintings, those floppy, pointed, or rounded caps that cover the head. They weren't just decorative. Body heat escapes through the scalp, and in a cold, drafty room, that could mean misery. A good nightcap kept you warm and protected from damp. Some caps were even laced with herbal oils to keep lice at bay, or, at the very least, to make your pillow smell better than your feet. Men and women both wore them. Though men's tended to be simpler, women might add a kerchief or scarf, layered beneath to preserve hairstyling or modesty, especially if sharing the room with in-laws, because yes, sleeping arrangements were that cozy. Of course, all these rituals revolved around the idea that you could control sleep, but deep down, people knew they couldn't. You could wrap yourself in layers, chant your psalms, stuff lavender under the bed frame, but if the night wanted to turn on you, it would. Dreams came whether invited or not. Spirits, if they existed, ignored dress codes, and so there was always an edge to these nightly preparations, a quiet fear disguised as tradition. You weren't just dressing for bed, you were dressing for the unknown, and if that meant sleeping in yesterday's boots or grandmother's cloak, you didn't question it. Eventually, you curl back under your blanket, or rather, the shared wool covering, and settle in. The layers itch, the air bites. Somewhere nearby, someone coughs in their sleep, but you close your eyes anyway, because despite the discomfort, despite the strange patchwork of cloth you've wrapped yourself in, the world outside is even colder. And whatever you're wearing, at least you made it through another day. You're half asleep, half sinking into the familiar damp of your straw bed, when the smell reminds you of something you forgot your chamber pot. It's not glamorous. It never is. The thing sits cold and sour just under the edge of the bed, a squat clay or metal container, sometimes with a lid, sometimes not. Its contents are nobody's favorite part of the night. But when it's winter, and the latrine is 2 fields away, nobody's judging. That's just how it goes. You pray, then pee. Or maybe pee, then pray. Either way, both acts are nightly rituals, and both come with consequences if ignored. Because in the Middle Ages, your body wasn't just your own. It was a thing to be disciplined, feared, and sanctified even while half asleep. Let's start with the prayer. The moment before bed was sacred, and almost everyone, peasant, priest, noble, or thief, had some version of a bedtime invocation. Maybe it was the Lord's Prayer. Maybe it was a short rhyme passed down from a grandmother with calloused hands and missing teeth. If I die before I wake wasn't a modern invention. It came from real, reasonable fear. People went to sleep not knowing if they'd wake. Illness, house fires, animal bites, or plain cold could carry you away in silence. So you whispered to the dark, asking God to notice you, to protect your dreams, to keep the devil at bay. And when you couldn't remember the words exactly, you mumbled something anyway. Silence was worse. Now, back to the pot. It wasn't a convenience. It was a necessity. If you had any wealth at all, your chamber pot might be glazed ceramic with floral patterns. If you were poor, it might just be a repurposed bowl or wooden bucket. Either way, it was nearby. People didn't walk outside to relieve themselves unless they absolutely had to. Town latrines were shared and often overflowing. If you lived in a castle, you might have a garderobe a hole in the stone wall dropping waste directly outside the building into a moat or pit. But those weren't common. Most people kept things simple: a pot, emptied in the morning, and if you were a servant, emptying it wasn't optional, it was your first job of the day. Oddly enough, this nocturnal urination wasn't private. Not really. In a room with multiple people, the slosh of someone reaching under the bed, the soft scrape of ceramic, the awkward hiss, it all happened in earshot. Nobody said anything. It was like coughing or snoring. Everyone did it, and everyone pretended they didn't. Still, some people, especially modest women or nervous guests, waited until the midnight wakeful period to sneak out and find privacy in a corner. There are records of people tripping in the dark, spilling pots, or worse, grabbing the wrong one to drink from. Yes, that happened. More than once. Historians still debate whether medieval people had a better sense of humor or just lower standards for trauma. But not all-night routines were so grimy. The spiritual side of bedtime ran deep. In wealthier homes, prayer books were placed beside the bed, illuminated manuscripts with golden ink, little images of angels, or, and curiously, skeletons, because death was never far from the conversation. People prayed not just for safety, but for forgiveness. If you'd sinned during the day, lied, cheated, skipped mass, you confessed it in whispers before sleep, hoping to start the next morning clean. This wasn't just religion, it was insurance. Dying in your sleep without absolution could mean purgatory, or worse. So people did their spiritual bookkeeping nightly, even if they were too tired to finish a full prayer. Sometimes, bedtime also meant a chat with the dead. It sounds eerie now, but many believed that sleep thinned the veil between worlds, that the souls of relatives might appear in dreams, or hover nearby, listening. People left a space in the bed for a deceased spouse. They spoke to long-gone children, hoping to hear their laughter in sleep. And, in a strange way, this softened the fear of night. If the dead were near, maybe they were also protective. A family of ghosts watching over the fire, shaking their heads at how poorly you fluffed your pillow. Let's talk about the pillow. While we're at it, if you even had one, it was a small luxury. Most were sacks of straw, bundled tightly, tied at the ends. A real down-stuffed pillow made with goose feathers was a serious status symbol. And yes, some nobles had them embroidered with prayers. Others stitched charms into the corners, little knots of red thread or fragments of bone wrapped in linen, all meant to ward off the night. Sleep was never just sleep. It was a vulnerable plunge into the unknown, and people took precautions however they could. For children, the bedtime routine could be a blend of care and control. Parents taught them simple rhymes to chant while lying down, hoping it would keep their minds off nightmares or hunger. In some households, kids were lightly tapped with a wooden spoon before bed, a weird blend of blessing and discipline. Go to sleep or the night spirits will hear you. Mothers warned, half joking, and children believed them. Of course they did. The night creaked, shadows moved, wind made the house speak, and sometimes, if you listened too hard, you heard your name whispered from the corners. In towns, bedtime came with noise. You're trying to sleep, but the streets outside are not silent. There's the shout of a drunk stumbling home, the creak of a wagon, the bark of stray dogs. Curfews were technically enforced in many medieval cities. Bells rang to signal the closing of shops and the extinguishing of fires. But not everyone obeyed. Some bakers were still kneading dough, some blacksmiths were stoking embers for the morning's work, and others, more secretive, slipped through alleys with purposes better left undiscovered. That's why you double bolt your door and place a broom against the lintel to catch intruders or confuse spirits. It's a superstition, sure, but one your grandmother swore by. And speaking of superstition, some people place knives under the pillow. Not to fight burglars though, maybe that too, but to stab dreams. The belief was that if you dreamt of something evil, the blade, hidden under your head, could stop the vision from taking root. There are even tales of people waking to see a shadowy figure beside the bed, only to reach beneath their pillow and find comfort in cold iron. Historians don't agree on whether this was symbolic or just a practical defense against rats. Either way, you sleep better knowing it's there. The chamber pot, meanwhile, waits patiently under the bed. It's the quiet roommate nobody mentions, unless it's full. Some wealthier homes hired a groom of the stool, an actual title, whose job involved managing the monarch's bathroom needs, which is hilarious until you remember that such a role meant intimate access to royalty. In fact, it came with power. The person who handled the king's pot might also be the one whispering into his ear each morning. The hierarchy of hygiene had unexpected influence. Eventually, the fire dies lower. The prayers end. The children stop squirming. Someone shifts, sighs, tucks the blanket tighter. You know you'll wake again soon, somewhere around midnight. But for now, you close your eyes, just for a little while. The night isn't done with you yet, but it can wait. You're stirring again, just as expected. The second phase of night yawns open, and your eyes blink against the dark. The fire is mostly embers now, casting long, low glows across the room, like old secrets breathing in their sleep. Around you, others are shifting too. Someone mutters half of a dream, another coughs, another rises and shuffles quietly to the pot. But in some homes, especially among the poor or rural folk, the movement has a different rhythm tonight. There's a clang of a pan, the muted chop of something wooden, maybe even the hiss of hot liquid. Yes, it's midnight, and someone is making a snack. Because, believe it or not, the medieval world didn't fully sleep through the night. And during this wakeful pause between the first and second sleep, many people embraced the odd little tradition of eating. It wasn't weird. It wasn't frowned upon. It was comfort, and possibly even a little holy. You rise slowly, pulling your cloak tighter, and pad across the cold floor to the hearth. Someone's already there. A mother, a farmhand, or an older sibling reheating a thick oat mash, or pouring out milk that's been kept warm in a clay pot tucked near the coals. You're not feasting, you're nibbling. Midnight meals weren't luxurious spreads. They were leftovers, bread crusts, dried fruits, sometimes a bit of salted meat if there was any left from dinner. It might be reheated stew, maybe barley gruel, for the better off. Sweet wine or watered ale might be sipped slowly while wrapped in fur. The goal wasn't fullness, it was comfort. Just enough to quiet the stomach or warm the hands. Enough to tempt the body back to rest. Why the midnight snack? In part, because people's schedules were fragmented. Sleep came early, often just after sunset. That meant by midnight, the body had already digested dinner. Hunger wasn't rare, and there was also a religious undertone. In some monastic traditions, this midnight hour known as the Vigilia was designated for prayer and light sustenance. Something simple, something humble. Eating was considered part of the body's spiritual rhythm, a little nourishment before the soul descended into second sleep and deeper dreams. Historians still argue whether these snacks were encouraged or merely tolerated, but the evidence suggests people embraced them with quiet enthusiasm. Not everyone approved. Of course, certain theologians warned against gluttony, even in the dark. One 13th century sermon scolded townsfolk for rising at night to chew the flesh of beasts instead of chewing the words of God, but others, more practical, recognized that the body needs tending. Priests who oversaw convents and monasteries sometimes permitted warm milk or bread to ease digestion and reduce night sweats. And in some households, especially those with young children, the practice became routine. Mothers woke with a baby, soothed the child, then sat by the embers chewing dried apple slices or soaking stale bread in broth. What you eat depends on who you are. If you're in a city, you might have access to cheese or almonds, or a bit of honeycomb kept in a linen pouch to keep it from melting. In the countryside, it's more rustic. Flatbread baked in the afternoon and set aside for the night. Cold porridge, maybe sweetened with forage berries if they're in season. And sometimes, it's just a sip of watered wine. Not to intoxicate, just to relax. Wine at night wasn't unusual. It was seen as medicinal, a way to settle the belly, calm the nerves, and smooth the descent into sleep. In one medical manuscript from the 1400s, warm wine with crushed herbs was recommended to cleanse the mind before dream. Imagine that. a midnight drink to filter your thoughts. Sometimes the meal was shared. This wasn't solitary snacking in silence. Families gathered again, albeit quietly, near the hearth. Soft conversations resumed stories half finished before first sleep were continued now, with yawns and chuckles. An argument from the afternoon might be re-examined with gentler tones. Lovers murmured in corners. Old couples held hands in silence. There's something tender about this hour. No rush, no expectation, just the rhythm of human presence. The intimacy of half dreaming and half listening. The food binds it together. In inns or communal lodging, these wakeful hours could turn into informal feasts. Travelers who had gone to sleep early might now rise and unpack a hunk of bread, offer a slice to a bunkmate, pass around dried sausage or nuts. Someone might hum a song quietly. Others would listen, not a party, more like a slow, shared moment in the middle of night's vast belly. A space between sleep where life softened and hunger, both bodily and emotional, was gently met. But of course, this wasn't universal. Some people avoided eating at night. Superstitions warned that feeding during darkness attracted spirits. Others believed certain foods disturbed dreams. Cheese, in particular, was notorious. A late bite of cheese, they said, could bring nightmares or worse, visions. There's a record from southern France of a farmer refusing all dairy after sunset, convinced it made his soul too visible to wandering dead. He might have had a point, or lactose intolerance. Historians aren't sure. Meanwhile, physicians debated the practice. Medieval medicine was still steeped in humoral theory, the belief that the body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Food, especially at night, was thought to tip the balance. Eating too late could cause an excessive phlegm, leading to coughs, or encourage melancholy dreams. Still, doctors often made exceptions. For the elderly, for the sick, for the overly imaginative, let him eat, one medieval doctor wrote, if it soothes the windings of his mind. You finish your bread slowly, thumb wiping away a crumb. Your hands hover toward the fire. It's still warm, but dying. The red embers look like sleepy eyes, refusing to close. The silence around you is thicker now. The others have returned to bed. A child yawns. A dog stirs. You rise carefully and place the dish to the side, where it won't be stepped on. There's no dishwasher, no napkin, no toothpick. You simply wipe your hands on your tunic and crawl back under the wool. Some nights, the meal helps. Others, your stomach growls again in an hour. But this is life. You've done what people have done for centuries. A bite, a sip, a shared glance in the dark, a moment of warmth against the chill. There's something oddly reassuring about it. Not dramatic, not luxurious, but enough. Enough to settle your belly, enough to soften the edge of the waking world, and enough to carry you quietly toward that second sleep, the deeper one, the dream-laced one, the one where things are not what they seem. You try to fall back asleep, but there's a weight in the air that feels older than the cold. Something presses on your chest, not physically, but with a kind of tension you can't quite name. Maybe it's the wind outside that groans like a door left ajar. Maybe it's the memory of someone telling you not to leave your shoes facing the bed, lest something crawl into them from the shadows. Or maybe it's the quiet medieval certainty that the night is not empty. Because in this time, sleep is not safe, and dreams are not just dreams. People believe that something waits in the dark, something with breath but no face, a spirit, a demon, a sickness in the shape of a shadow. You lie still, pretending you're not awake, as if the very act of noticing might attract its gaze. Welcome to the age of night terrors, not the clinical kind, but the spiritual kind. When fear isn't a symptom, it's a guest. One of the most deeply rooted fears in the medieval world was the incubus. The word itself comes from Latin incubare, to lie upon, and the name describes exactly what people claimed happened. You'd wake in the middle of the night, unable to move, feeling something pressing down on your chest, breathing over your face, sometimes speaking into your ear. You couldn't scream, you couldn't fight, all you could do was endure it. Today we'd call this sleep paralysis, a natural neurological event. But then, then it was evidence. Proof that something had entered your room, that the night was alive and chose you, and worse, people believed the incubus wasn't just a haunting, it was an assault, a violation of the body and soul alike. Women weren't the only ones afraid. Men, too, had their stories of a figure sitting on their chest, of a woman-like shadow with claws, of waking drenched in sweat and shame. In some regions, the female counterpart, the succubus, was said to visit monks and tempt them with carnal visions, a moral failure disguised as a dream. Some abbeys even kept logs of brothers who reported recurring visions, flagging them for confession or penance. Historians still debate whether these accounts were genuine fears, psychological projections, or coded language for something else entirely. But what's certain is that sleep wasn't trusted. Your body was seen as vulnerable, a porous boundary between the spiritual world and the waking one. Not all night demons were sexual, though. Some were thieves, some were suffocators, some were simply watchers. In Germanic folklore, you had the Alp, a creature that slipped through keyholes, or sat in a corner until everyone was asleep, then crouched on a person's chest and whispered nightmares directly into their mind. It wore a cap. That's how you knew it was there. In other regions, it was the Mara, an Old Norse word tied to the very root of nightmare. This figure, usually female, didn't attack. She just watched, sat at the end of the bed, stared until your bones felt hollow. She might steal your breath, or your thoughts. She might twist your dreams so you'd wake and forget who you were. And people didn't just accept this. They fought back ritually. Beds were surrounded with charms, spoons made of ash wood, iron nails under the mattress, psalms scratched into the wood above the headboard. Mothers tied garlic bundles to their children's cradles. Some people hung holy water phials above their pillows, or sewed crosses into their sheets. Others left out offerings, milk, salt, breadcrumbs, hoping to appease whatever roamed the hallways in the dark. And in truly desperate cases, a priest might bless the bedroom or anoint the four corners with oil, not because the building was cursed, because sleep itself was dangerous. This fear bled into every social class, from peasants to princes. No one was exempt. King Charles VI of France, for example, reportedly suffered from terrifying visions during the night, waking to hallucinations that lasted until sunrise. His physicians believed it was the result of an imbalance of the humors. Others whispered that he had been touched by something darker, or he wasn't the only ruler to fear the night. In some courts, guards were instructed not to leave their posts until the king had fully entered second sleep, because only then was he considered beyond the reach of demons. Sleep was a fortress, but only if it was guarded. Children, of course, were the most vulnerable. They were light sleepers, prone to dreams, often left alone while adults worked into the night or passed out from exhaustion. In some areas, parents painted symbols on walls, circles, crosses, even crude depictions of angels to create dream traps, designs that would distract spirits long enough for the child to fall deeply asleep. If a child woke screaming, they weren't hushed, they were questioned. What did you see? Did it speak? Did it touch you? Then the room was purified, smoked with herbs, sprinkled with salt, not because the dream was bad, because it might have been real. And yet, despite all this fear, there was also fascination. Some people wanted to be visited. Mystics and visionaries claimed the night offered portals to divine communication. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun and prophet, wrote of dreams where fire spoke and the stars chanted hymns. She believed these visions were holy messages. Others warned that the line between vision and delusion was thin. A dream could make you a saint or a heretic. It depended on who heard about it. The medical community, such as it was, tried to explain. Sleep disorders were labeled with elaborate names and treated with poultices, prayers, or dietary changes. If you had night terrors, you might be told to sleep with your head elevated or avoid cold meats. Some physicians recommended boiled lettuce. Others suggested chanting. Still others insisted on bloodletting, because clearly, too much blood made your dreams too vivid. The logic was fuzzy. The fear was not. Even architecture was shaped by this dread. Beds were positioned away from doors. Some were built into alcoves, with walls on 3 sides, to make it harder for spirits to reach you. In many homes, the bed faced east not just for sun, but to align with holy orientation. And always, there were the curtains, heavy, dark, meant to block drafts but also to hide whatever came to stare. The fear of night creatures didn't end with sleep. It followed into waking life. People accused of witchcraft were often charged with nighttime visitations. She came to me in my bed. One accusation reads, "She sat on my chest and smiled." These weren't metaphors. These were testimonies. People believed their sleep was being invaded, and sometimes they demanded justice. Today, you might laugh, call it superstition, chalk it up to bad dreams, poor diet, or an overactive imagination. But tonight, as you close your eyes and hear the wind slide its fingers down the side of the house, maybe you understand. Maybe there's a sliver of your mind that still wonders, still watches, still listens for the quiet breath beside your ear that isn't yours. Because in the medieval world, sleep wasn't rest. It was exposure. You surrendered your body and hoped something else didn't take your place before morning. You roll over in your sleep, or try to, but there's an elbow in your ribs and someone's foot across your thigh. You grumble, half awake, but don't move. You know how this works. You're not alone in the bed. You're never alone in the bed. In fact, you're lucky to have made it onto the straw sack at all. Because in the Middle Ages, sleeping wasn't just a private retreat. It was a social event, an economic decision, and sometimes a logistical nightmare. Welcome to the curious and occasionally awkward custom of bed sharing. Tonight, your pillow might be your arm, and your bunkmate might be a stranger with garlic breath and suspiciously cold toes. But again, this isn't strange. It's routine. Space was scarce, warmth was priceless, and privacy was a luxury very few could afford. So, you shared beds, blankets, snores, and all. In a medieval inn, you don't pay for a room. You pay for a spot, specifically, a spot in a bed. That bed might be already occupied by someone else, maybe 2 people, maybe 3. You don't know them. They don't know you, but you're tired. It's raining, and your boots are soaked, so you nod politely, climb in, and pray they don't talk in their sleep. This practice, known as bedding with a stranger, was entirely normal. Innkeepers didn't have dozens of separate rooms to offer. They had 1 or 2 big rooms with several beds, or maybe just one large bed, and guests were expected to share. They might be merchants on the road, pilgrims, tradesmen, even students traveling between towns. If you were a woman traveling alone, you might be placed beside another woman, or not. Historians still argue how often this led to conflict, and how often it led to things better left unspoken. Of course, sharing a bed wasn't just about space, it was about warmth. These were cold buildings, drafty, damp, often unheated. People relied on body heat, which meant the more bodies, the better. Some even requested to sleep with the heaviest person available. More heat, less chill, and yes, snoring was common. So were smells. But that wasn't the point. The point was to survive the night without shivering your bones into dust. Even at home, families shared beds out of necessity. Parents slept with their children, often arranged like sardines heads to feet to heads to conserve warmth and limit fights. Siblings shared until marriage. Servants bunked beside masters, or in a corner on the floor if they were lucky. In smaller homes, the entire family might sleep in the same room, with grandparents nearest the fire, the youngest near the wall, and everyone else tucked between. If someone woke up coughing, everyone heard it. If someone had a nightmare, someone else whispered reassurance. It was communal, intimate, claustrophobic, but it was also how people survived. In castles and manor houses, the layout was more complex, but not always more private. A lord and lady might have a private chamber, but they still shared their bed with attendants, especially during travel. Royalty rarely slept alone, not just because of companionship, but because of surveillance. Being watched meant being safe from assassination, from theft, from scandal. There are even records of monarchs sharing beds with visiting nobles to demonstrate trust or form alliances. Imagine that today, closing a treaty and then crawling under the same blanket. Symbolism mattered, and sometimes Bed sharing was ceremonial. Apprentices slept near their masters as part of training. Pages slept near knights, absorbing habits and discipline. A bishop might share a bed with a young cleric, not for anything illicit, but because it was the expected norm of mentorship. You learn by osmosis. You breathe the same air. You mimic the snore pattern. That's just how it went. Now, let's talk about guest culture. If someone visited your home friend, cousin, fellow pilgrim, you offered them a place in your bed. It was hospitality. Turning them away would be shameful. So you scooted over, made room, and pretended not to mind their bony knees. There's a letter from a 15th century noblewoman complaining, rather hilariously, that her cousin elbowed me most cruelly in the spleen, and yet snored with such peace as to make angels jealous. Bed sharing required patience and a certain surrender of boundaries. Of course, this setup came with problems. Illness spread fast, lice jumped freely, colds, coughs. Even the plague, it all passed from body to body by proximity. Some towns tried to introduce sleeping regulations during outbreaks, but they rarely worked. People needed to sleep, and the only way to sleep was together. Health officials might post notices discouraging shared bedding, but unless you were rich enough for your own room, you simply did what you always did shared, hoped, and prayed. There were unspoken rules. You didn't face your neighbor unless invited. You didn't speak unless spoken to, and you certainly didn't touch. If someone crossed the line, they might be kicked literally or asked to leave. In inns, some travelers used rolled-up cloaks as dividers. Others stacked shoes between them as a makeshift wall. But the truth is, boundaries were blurry. You learned to ignore the snoring, tolerate the twitching, and accept the occasional knee to the ribs as the cost of staying warm. In some households, sleeping arrangements were flexible. On festival nights or family gatherings, beds might be rearranged, with multiple generations squeezed into spaces not meant for so many. Children giggled, elders grumbled, someone always lost the blanket. But there was a sense of unity in it, a reminder that you belonged to a larger body of family, of town, of faith. That said, not all beds were equal. Social hierarchy persisted even at bedtime. In noble homes, the Lord's bed might be raised on a dais, symbolizing his status. Curtains separated him from the rest, even if the room was shared. Servants slept nearby, but always lower. In monasteries, senior monks had the best spots closest to the fire, furthest from the draft. Novices slept on thinner mats, sometimes in corridors. The bed wasn't just a place of rest, it was a physical manifestation of your rank. There were also symbolic roles. To be invited into someone's bed wasn't always about sex. It could signify trust, protection, or alliance. Knights sharing beds after battle, widows inviting a niece to sleep beside them for comfort, pilgrims sharing beds on the road to Rome or Santiago, discussing relics and sins until second sleep claimed them both. Despite the discomfort, many people look back on these moments fondly. Bed sharing created bonds. You learned a person's habits, their fears, their dreams. You whispered confessions in the dark. You laughed at each other's groans. And when morning came, you rose together aching, scratched, possibly bitten, but undeniably connected. Eventually, you drift again. You've managed to carve out just enough space between shoulders and knees. You pull the blanket tighter, ignore the foot twitching against your shin, and let the warmth wrap around you. The room creaks. Someone snores. And for better or worse, you are not alone. You wake up stiff, not just from the mattress, though the straw poking through the sack hasn't helped, but from the weight of something less visible. Status, position, power, all of it wrapped around your limbs like a second, invisible blanket. Because tonight, you're sleeping like royalty. And sleeping like royalty, as it turns out, isn't necessarily restful. You're in a vast stone chamber. The ceiling arches above like a church, the walls heavy with tapestries meant to keep out the cold and the whispers. Your bed is raised, carved from oak, with legs like tree trunks and a canopy so elaborate it could double as a throne. There are thick linens, embroidered sheets, fur coverings, velvet cushions. It all looks magnificent, and yet you can't stop scratching. because even kings had lice. Royal beds were marvels of craftsmanship, symbols of wealth, divine favor, and political status. A monarch's bed was not simply a piece of furniture, it was a stage. Foreign envoys might be received, while the ruler lay reclined on silks, giving orders with one hand and sipping from a goblet with the other. In many courts, the levee, the royal waking ceremony, involved multiple attendants, entering the bedchamber each morning to dress, groom, and brief the sovereign. That meant the king or queen didn't just sleep in the bed, they performed in it. From the moment their eyes opened, they were public. Every sigh, stretch, or complaint about the night was part of the day's political theater. But comfort, that wasn't always included. These beds were not soft. Feather-stuffed mattresses were rare and expensive, and even then, they sagged quickly. Beneath them were rope lattices that had to be retightened constantly. If a servant forgot, you'd roll to the middle like a sack of barley. The sheets, while expensive, were rarely washed. Laundry was labor-intensive, and linens were delicate. Even in royal households, bedding was aired more often than scrubbed. So while it looked luxurious, it smelled like skin, smoke, and if you lifted the covers, possibly something worse. Insects didn't discriminate. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs infested noble and commoner alike. The difference: nobles could pay someone to comb them out. Some monarchs kept specialized attendants who handled nothing but hygiene, brushing hair, inspecting undergarments, even delousing the royal scalp. But the bugs returned, because the castle was cold, and the bed was warm, and every thread was a perfect hiding place. It's said that Queen Elizabeth Martha had her bedding changed more often than most people bathed, and even she wasn't spared the occasional infestation. Historians still debate whether this constant discomfort influenced royal temperaments. Imagine running an empire with a flea bite behind your ear. The fire in a royal chamber was larger, but so was the room. Heat scattered quickly. Thick tapestries hung on the walls to insulate, sometimes even around the bed itself, forming a cloth cocoon known as a tester. It looked grand, but mostly it served to trap body heat and block drafts. Some nobles had the foot of the bed built into the wall itself for extra warmth, like sleeping in a wooden pocket. Others kept dogs at the foot of the bed, not for companionship, for warmth. Small lapdogs were prized not because they were cute, but because they functioned as organic hot water bottles. And if they had fleas, well, at least you knew they were biting the dog and not you. Privacy was relative. A royal bedchamber might have multiple people in it, at night attendants, guards, personal physicians. The idea of sleeping alone was alien to many monarchs, not because they feared solitude, but because they feared assassination. In some courts, a body servant slept in the same bed as the king, to ensure no one slipped poison into the sheets or into the sovereign himself. Think about that. You're the most powerful person in the land, and yet you can't close your eyes without someone else nearby, watching, listening, sometimes pretending to be asleep. And yet, with all this ceremonial pressure, royalty still had to contend with the same human problems as everyone else. Sleep disruptions, toothaches, indigestion, snoring. Henry VIII, famously gluttonous, is thought to have suffered from sleep apnea. The man who reshaped England's religious landscape may have done so on very little rest. Louis XIV of France had over 100 people attend his couche, the ritual of going to bed. But once the curtains were drawn and the candle snuffed, it was just him, alone in a bed too grand to be comfortable, surrounded by stone and silence, and the weight of a crown pressed invisibly into the pillow. In noble households, children were trained early to respect the sanctity of the bedchamber. Servants entered only when summoned. Beds were sometimes consecrated by priests, especially before a royal birth. And speaking of which, many royal births happened in bed, surrounded by women, behind tightly closed curtains. The bed was not just a resting place, it was a stage for life, death, politics, and lineage. Monarchs died in bed. Heirs were announced from it, treaties were whispered beneath its canopy, and every night, the ruler climbed back in, pulling the covers over a body that had to survive until morning. Food was sometimes brought to bed not just because of laziness, but because meals could be safer when eaten in the private chamber, away from prying eyes or poisoned goblets. A bit of sugared almond, a small roast bird, Perhaps a warm wine, infused with herbs to soothe the nerves. Physicians might prescribe nighttime cordials to assist with sleep. Whether they worked is debatable, but the ritual of sipping something warm while lying against an embroidered pillow, with attendants waiting just beyond the curtain, certainly felt like medicine. Even dreams had political significance. A monarch's dream could be interpreted as an omen, a prophecy, or a warning. Kings and queens often consulted court astrologers or dream readers. A nightmare wasn't dismissed, it was documented. Some rulers even delayed decisions if the dream that preceded them seemed ill-fated. And if a monarch dreamt of a dead relative or a battlefield, everyone paid attention. The bed wasn't just a cradle for sleep, it was an altar for fate. There are records of kings refusing to change pillows after a battle, believing the bloodstains carried victory. Others insisted on sleeping in a dead ancestor's bed before a coronation. The symbolism was dense, layered, often bizarre. One royal bedroom was lined entirely in white, with every object, bedposts, sheets, chamber pot dyed the same pale shade, meant to purify the body during sleep. Another ruler demanded that every candle in his chamber be extinguished in a specific order, or else he feared he wouldn't wake. But beneath all the performance, all the ritual and display, one thing remains constant: the search for rest. Even kings needed sleep. Even queens wept into pillows. Even lords sat up in the dark, scratching bites and wondering if tomorrow would bring peace or rebellion. You shift under the imagined weight of velvet sheets. You glance toward the darkened canopy overhead, and for a moment, you realize power doesn't protect you from the night. It just changes the size of your bed. Eventually, the chamber cools. The final candle gutters. The dogs snore at the foot of the bed. Somewhere outside the window, a bell rings in the distance, marking the third watch of the night. And even in a room laced with gold thread and surrounded by guards, the monarch finally exhales, shifts onto one side, and sleeps, or tries to. The room is dark now, truly dark, and the kind of quiet that settles into your chest rather than your ears. You can feel the air thick with stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of wood, the soft rustle of cloth, or the long exhale of someone dreaming nearby. But there's one last ritual before surrendering fully to sleep, and it has nothing to do with prayers or potions. It's something you do with your hands. You reach out, slowly, and begin the strange little task of tucking in the bed. Not yourself, the bed. Because in the medieval world, people didn't tuck in their children, they tucked their furniture. And the way you managed your sleeping space said just as much about you as your shoes, your manners, or your sins. It wasn't only about comfort, it was about protection, order, and sometimes superstition. You don't lay down and drift off. You prepare your bed like a soldier checks his armor, like a priest lays the altar. The canopy, the curtains, the folds of the blanket, all of it had purpose, and none of it was casual. Start with the curtains. They hang heavy around you, made of wool, linen, or if you're especially lucky, a blend with silk. They're not there for fashion. They serve the very practical purpose of keeping out drafts, since houses and castles were notoriously cold, and they offer at least the illusion of privacy. In a home where rooms are shared, voices carry, and the flicker of firelight dances across faces. Pulling a curtain closed was like closing a door. But beyond their function, bed curtains were loaded with meaning. They were embroidered with family crests, religious symbols, or simple protective motifs: birds, vines, crosses, or even suns. Images meant to guide dreams, ward off evil, or remind the sleeper of their place in the cosmos. And they weren't just pulled shut, they were tucked, carefully, precisely. Some families had small wooden rods to fasten them into place. Others used leather cords to tie them closed. A loose curtain could flap in the night, startle a child, or worse, invite in things that didn't belong. There are records of people waking in terror because their curtain had come undone. The wind opened the veil. One diary reads, "And I feared the devil was near." Historians still debate whether these fears were literal or symbolic, but they were real enough to make people tie knots with trembling hands. Then there's the bedding itself. Medieval beds weren't one seamless cushion. They were layered. First, the ropes underneath had to be checked. If they'd loosened during the night, Someone had to kneel down, tighten them with a bed key, and retie the corners. Otherwise, the mattress would sag, and the sleeper would wake in the shape of a bent horseshoe. On top of the ropes went the pallet, a thick pad stuffed with straw, hay, or feathers. This, too, had to be smoothed and patted down. A lumpy mattress could cause bruises, misalign your spine, or if folklore was to be believed, trap bad spirits. Then came the sheets. If you had them, linen was preferred, but costly. Poor homes made do with wool or rough-spun cloth. The sheet was pulled taut, corners folded under the pallet like wrapping a gift, and on top of that, the blanket, usually wool, thick and scratchy. In wealthier homes, it might be fur-lined or even quilted with decorative stitching. But again, even the rich weren't exempt from the nightly ritual, the folding, the smoothing, the precise alignment of edges. Why? Because the orderliness of your bed was believed to influence your sleep. A messy bed bred messy dreams. Some even believed that demons favored disheveled sheets, that they crept into the folds like mice. And here's the oddest part, people believed the bed itself needed rest. Not just the person. There are written references to beds being settled for the night, much like a fire. The tucking wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, like putting the house to sleep. One manuscript from the 14th century describes a woman who whispered to her bed each night, thanking it for holding her bones another day. Whether it was superstition or ritualistic gratitude, the act was real. The bed wasn't just a passive object, it was a partner in survival. In noble homes, the task of tucking the bed was often left to servants, but even they treated it with reverence. Some were trained in the art of bedding, yes, that was a thing. How to lay the sheets without wrinkles, how to fold the blanket so the crest faced the right direction, how to position the pillows so the scent of lavender sachets wafted upward. In royal courts, bed making could be political. The positioning of certain colors or patterns might signal alliances or mourning. The wrong detail could be interpreted as insult. There's an account from a Spanish ambassador who stormed out of a guest chamber because the bed's drapes were the wrong shade of blue. Apparently, it was the color of his enemies. Even children participated in the ritual. They were taught how to fold, how to tuck, how to smooth the edges just so. It wasn't just a chore, it was character training. An unmade bed reflected an undisciplined soul. Some parents checked beds at night not for monsters, but for disorder. Straighten the corner or shame the Lord. One stern father was recorded as saying, and he wasn't joking. Bed tucking also served as a kind of medieval alarm system. If the curtain was drawn in a certain way, or a blanket was arranged over the edge, it could signal whether someone was inside or if they'd risen and not returned. Lovers arranged their bedding to indicate secrecy. Monks followed strict folding guidelines that mirrored their monastic order's values. Everything meant something, even the angle of the pillow. For the deeply devout, the final act of tucking might be accompanied by a sign of the cross drawn with a finger on the sheet, or a whispered Latin phrase, half remembered from childhood. Some kissed the pillow, some kissed the wall, and some, particularly the anxious or elderly, placed a candle stub by the bedside not to light, but as a symbol of light returning, a promise to the dark. Then, slowly, with the bed dressed and the curtains sealed, you lower yourself back down. The air inside the canopy is warmer now, still musty, still tinged with smoke and the faint scent of sheep's wool, but comforting. The world outside fades. The tucking is complete. Nothing has been left to chance. Outside the bed, the room might hold chaos, socks scattered, fire flickering, dogs pacing, but inside the curtains, everything is still, straight, protected, maybe even sacred. It's strange to think that all of this gentle ritual of folding and smoothing, was born not of luxury, but of necessity. Beds were hard to make, harder to keep clean, and absolutely essential for staying alive through the long, cold night. And so they were honored, tucked, blessed, prepared, like sails on a ship, ready for the dream sea beyond. And you lie there now, tucked in not just by hands but by history, not just under blankets, but under centuries of habit, fear, care, and tenderness disguised as routine. You don't just sleep, You surrender, and as the quiet presses in, the fire sighs, and the night deepens into its second half. You find yourself still, finally, and fully held. You're barely stirring now, your limbs heavy, mind dim, but in the corners of your thoughts, just before the next wave of sleep, there's a flicker of guilt. Strange, isn't it? You've worked all day, eaten little, endured cold, fleas, and aching joints, and still you feel it, that whisper of self-judgment for letting your eyes close again. In the medieval world, sleep wasn't only about rest, it was also about morality, and too much of it. Sinful. Sloth wasn't just a bad habit, it was one of the 7 deadly sins, and the bed, warm and tempting, was treated with a kind of suspicion. Yes, you were allowed to sleep, but not enjoy it, not linger in it, not make a friend of it. To sleep too long was to let the devil in not through your dreams, but through your weakness. Clergy and theologians spent centuries warning people about the dangers of oversleeping. Manuals and sermons described long sleep as the chain by which Satan binds idle souls. Monks were woken before dawn to chant, kneel, recite. Kneel again, not because they were particularly energetic, but because wakefulness was holy. Vigilance was the proof of a disciplined life. Sleeping in was for the gluttonous, the lustful, the weak, and even if your body cried for more rest, your conscience was trained to say no. This wasn't about productivity. It was about the soul. The longer you slept, the more time you gave the devil to whisper to your heart. Common folk weren't immune to this pressure either. Church bells rang to mark canonical hours, reminding everyone when to rise and pray. Sleeping past matins, the pre-dawn prayers was frowned upon, especially in monastic or devout households. Parents nudged their children awake, not with kindness, but with cold water or sharp words. Up now, before sin creeps in. Sleeping late was associated with laziness, and laziness with moral decay. And if someone was known to sleep longer than others, neighbors whispered, was he sick? Was she consorting with spirits? Or just too fond of the bed? In some towns, people literally rang bells to wake the community. Not for emergencies, just to prevent lingering under blankets. The work bell in the morning, the noon bell, and the evening bell created a structure that left little room for dozing. Time wasn't tracked by watches, it was enforced by rhythm, and when you missed the rhythm, you were seen as discordant, a threat to the moral harmony of the village. Even literature reflected this. Folk tales warned of dreamers who slept too long and missed their lives. In one story, a man who slumbered through church service wakes to find his crops dead, his wife gone, and his name forgotten. Another tale tells of a woman who dreamed of heaven while she slept, only to discover that she died in her bed without repentance. These weren't bedtime stories, they were warnings. You were meant to rise, to move, to resist the comfort of rest. For nobles, the pressure took a different form. Nobility had more freedom to indulge, but that indulgence was constantly scrutinized. A lord who spent too much time in bed was said to be ruled by his stomach and loins, not by discipline. Ambassadors recorded how often kings rose in the morning. Late risers were called decadent, effeminate, weak-willed, and of course, there were exceptions. Sickly heirs, melancholic queens, but even they were pressured to perform their awakenings with grace. To be seen rising deliberate, composed, alert was a kind of virtue. And monks. Monks were sleep-deprived by design. Benedictine rule required them to rise several times during the night to pray. First sleep was short, the midnight watch was long, second sleep was interrupted. Their days were defined by bells, not dreams. And if they dozed during prayer, they were punished sometimes with physical labor, sometimes with fasting. One abbot wrote that a sleeping monk was a door left open for Satan's laughter. A bit extreme, perhaps. But the message was clear: sleep was a battleground, and your soul was at stake. Of course, people still needed it, so they justified it. Farmers who rose before dawn reminded themselves they were closer to God. Women who worked late into the night, spinning wool, claimed virtue in their weariness. Even children were taught to count their sleep as a blessing, but only just enough. Just the right amount to rise strong, not spoiled. Too much sleep made you soft. and softness was suspicious. Medicine weighed in, too. Medieval physicians were torn. On one hand, sleep was essential to balance the humors, especially phlegm and black bile. On the other, excessive sleep was blamed for all sorts of ills, forgetfulness, weak digestion, nightmares, madness. One 15th century physician recommended no more than 6 hours, even for the elderly. Others went further, suggesting naps be avoided entirely unless prescribed. He who naps in daylight, one wrote, opens the window to disease. Harsh advice for someone just trying to survive a fever. This moral suspicion of sleep bled into architecture. Beds were placed facing east so the sleeper would rise with the sun. Some homes kept no shutters on eastern windows, ensuring morning light forced its way in. Monasteries designed their dormitories to allow the abbot easy sightlines. He could see who stirred, who slacked, who dared to turn over for one more minute of warmth. Privacy wasn't just a luxury, it was a threat to vigilance. But there was always the quiet rebellion, the peasant who turned over after the rooster crowed, the servant who tucked herself into a blanket an extra hour on Sunday morning, the widow who napped in the afternoon sun, daring the neighbors to judge. These small acts weren't laziness, they were resistance, moments of taking back a little softness in a world that demanded hard edges. And sometimes, those stolen sleeps were the sweetest, the ones that came unbidden, in defiance of bells and sermons, wrapped in the body's own wisdom. Ironically, some religious mystics viewed sleep differently. They saw dreams as divine communication. For them, sleep was a gateway, not a temptation. Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and other visionaries described holy dreams that came not despite sleep, but through it. They didn't fear the bed, they sanctified it. But for the average person, those exceptions only reinforced the rule: sleep was risky, not in body, but in soul. You lie there now, blanket up to your chin, warm but wary. You know the hour is late or early, depending on how you count the darkness. Soon the cock will crow, soon the village will stir, and you're still caught between waking and dreaming, between guilt and need, between doctrine and instinct. The fire has gone out. The last ember has blinked into black, and the voice in your head, the one inherited from centuries of monks, priests, and scolding mothers, tells you it's time to rise. But maybe you don't. Not yet. Maybe, just for one more moment, you close your eyes and drift, a little longer, a little deeper. You've earned it. Whether the church agrees or not, your eyes flutter open, not because of light or noise, but because something feels off. It's colder now. Your side aches from lying still too long. The blanket has slipped, and someone's arm, not yours, is draped across your shin. You can hear the wheeze of someone nearby, still sleeping, uneven, heavy, with that little catching sound that always makes you wonder if they'll stop breathing entirely. But there's no room to move, no space to escape it. You're on pilgrimage, and this is night 7 of sleeping like salted fish, packed side by side in the stone-arched belly of a chapel, repurposed for travelers. There's straw on the floor, cloaks bundled into pillows, and the faint scent of candle wax, old feet, and dried beans lingers in the air. Welcome to the spiritual sleepover. You've chosen the holy road, and your reward is overcrowded rooms, groaning joints, shared sweat, and a sincere hope that the relic you're traveling to see will cure you of the rash you probably caught 2 towns ago. Pilgrimage wasn't a vacation, it was penance. People traveled hundreds of miles on foot, sleeping in barns, cloisters, tavern lofts, or when fortune smiled, a designated pilgrim hostel. These weren't luxurious accommodations. Most were one large room, sometimes with raised wooden platforms, sometimes just the floor. Pilgrims brought their own bedding, rolled wool blankets, thin straw mats, sometimes just their cloaks, and they shared everything: air, space, body heat, and, unfortunately, diseases. But you didn't complain. To suffer discomfort was to draw nearer to God, to share in Christ's journey, to prove your devotion not just with prayer, but with blisters, cramped limbs, and the strange intimacy of sleeping beside a man who hasn't bathed in 3 weeks. You glance across the room. A candle sputters, The flame throws a shifting shadow across the worn icon hanging on the wall, St. James. Maybe, or some lesser-known martyr whose bones you're supposed to visit in 3 days. Around you, there are at least 20 bodies, old, young, noble, poor. Some snore like broken bellows. Others lie with eyes wide open, lost in thoughts they'll never share. Someone is muttering prayers. Another is crying quietly. No one interferes. On the road to a holy site, suffering is expected. Grief is sacred. Even at midnight, pilgrimage was open to all classes, but sleeping arrangements flattened status. A baron and a blacksmith might find themselves side by side in a crowded inn, forced to negotiate blanket borders and elbow etiquette. That's part of the spiritual test humility. You're all souls on a journey. Pride doesn't keep you warm at night. Wool does. And if someone offers you half a turnip in the middle of the night, you accept it, even if you suspect it's been in their pocket since Tuesday. Of course, not every night is spent in a holy house. Some nights, when towns are full or the roads are too long, you sleep outside, under trees, beside rivers, in ruined chapels that smell of bats and wet stone. Pilgrims carried few possessions: a staff, a badge, a water skin, maybe a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, but they carried a lot of faith, enough to close their eyes in the open, under stars, trusting that wolves or worse would pass them by. Some travelers tied bells to their cloaks to warn off animals. Others kept small icons under their pillows, tiny carved saints meant to watch over them as they slept. Whether they worked is anyone's guess, but belief, like hope, is a powerful sleeping aid. Pilgrim sleep was broken, the journey was exhausting, but the rest wasn't restorative. You woke with numb limbs, sore feet, aching back, and yet you walked, every day, for miles, in the rain, in the heat, in shoes that never fit quite right. And when night came, you didn't complain. You knelt, you prayed, and then you lay down beside people you didn't know, surrounded by the stale breath of strangers, and you slept, if only because your body gave you no choice. Some hostels offered more structure. In France and Spain, larger pilgrim houses near major shrines had rules. Men and women were sometimes separated. There were designated sleeping times, curfews, even prayer sessions before lights out. Meals were simple broth, bread, maybe dried peas. Beds were basic wooden boards or communal straw mats. And still, pilgrims came, because the discomfort wasn't a bug. It was a feature. The harder the road, the greater the grace. And along that road, people forged bonds. Shared sleep meant shared stories. Someone snored. You teased them in the morning. Someone cried out in their dreams. You offered them bread at breakfast. You learned to read the rhythms of strangers' sleep. The man who mumbled Latin verses. The woman who rocked side to side as if swaying in prayer. The child who clutched a wooden rosary, even in slumber. You knew them not by name, but by presence. And in a world where plague and war made life cheap, presence mattered. Some pilgrims wrote about their dreams. Others feared them. Sleeping in unfamiliar places stirred strange visions. There are accounts of travelers dreaming of saints, of blood, of fire, of heavenly music, of bones glowing beneath the earth. Were these signs warnings? Hallucinations born of fatigue and hunger? Historians still debate, but the medieval mind didn't separate dream from meaning. A vision on the road could change your course. A nightmare could send you home. People slept beside relics in hopes of dreams. They believed the spirit of a saint could whisper wisdom or healing through sleep. And if they woke weeping or radiant, they didn't question it. They just kept walking. And sometimes they didn't wake at all. Pilgrimage was dangerous. Exposure, infection, robbery, death traveled alongside you. Hostels kept records of the dead. Some offered burial services. Others simply passed on names to the next town. If you died in your sleep on the holy road, it was seen as a kind of blessing, a peaceful end in pursuit of grace. Your bedmate might wake to find you cold and still, your fingers wrapped around your staff. They'd close your eyes, say a prayer, and continue. No ceremony, just the silence of shared fate. Tonight, though, You're still breathing, still wrapped in your own sweat and someone else's blanket. Your feet twitch, your hips ache, but your mind begins to settle. You think of the shrine ahead, the relic, the saint, the promise of healing, redemption, or maybe just peace. That's what drives you. Not comfort, not luxury, just that fragile thread of belief stretching forward through each sleepless night. You shift again, careful not to wake the woman next to you. Her eyes flutter beneath closed lids. Her lips move, whispering something only she and God can hear. You pull your cloak tighter. The candle burns lower. The stone beneath you is hard, but familiar now, like penance turned to routine. You close your eyes, and for a moment, as the cold air brushes your cheek and the snores resume their chorus, you feel something close to stillness. Not comfort, exactly, but closeness, to suffering, to hope, to others. You're not sleeping well, but you're sleeping with others. And that, in this world, means you're still alive. You wake to the sound of something soft but persistent, like the sound of ashes shifting in a hearth, or a dog shaking itself dry. It takes a moment to remember where you are. Not in a bed, exactly, but something close, thick, rushes on a stone floor. Your head resting against a bundle of cloth that used to be your outer tunic, now folded into the shape of a pillow. There's no blanket, just your cloak wrapped tightly around your shoulders. Your fingers are numb. Your toes feel like coins pressed into mud. But still, you're lucky, because you're inside a castle, and inside a castle, people sleep differently. Not better, just differently. The stone walls protect you from the outside, but they don't keep out the cold. You might be behind iron gates and heavy doors, but warmth is a private privilege, and tonight, it's only yours if you've earned it. Castles were designed for defense, not comfort. The walls were thick, the windows narrow, and the rooms echoing with the weight of stone. Fireplaces existed, but were rare in lower chambers. Heat was inconsistent, generous near the hearth, bone-deep cold in the corners. People didn't sleep for pleasure. They slept for survival. And the key to survival layers, not just of blankets or furs, but of bodies, of animals, of structure. In the great hall, the servants might be curled near the dying fire, the dogs pressed against them like breathing furnaces. Further back, near the stairs or along the walls, others sleep in cloaks, using sacks or piles of hay. The scent is always the same damp wool, roasted meat from earlier, and the persistent undercurrent of wet stone. If you're a higher-ranking servant, you might be allowed to sleep on a wooden pallet raised just slightly off the floor. A thick cloth pad separates you from the boards. If you're a cook or a stable boy, you're likely in the outbuildings, sleeping in the loft above the animals. And while that might sound rough, it's actually warmer. The body heat of the livestock rises, curling into the hay and wrapping around you like an invisible blanket. You fall asleep to the shuffling of hooves and the rhythmic sigh of cows breathing in their sleep. Occasionally, a rooster crows early. You learn to ignore him. Now, if you're part of the noble household, your sleeping quarters are above the main hall, usually the solar, a slightly warmer, more private space reserved for the family and close attendants. The bed there is a grand affair, high, canopied, and heavy with furs. A feather mattress, perhaps, if the family is rich, or layers of wool-stuffed quilts. There's a tester above wooden frame holding the curtains and around it. Drapes are drawn to keep out drafts. A brazier may burn nearby, filling the room with a metallic warmth and faint smoke. But even here, the fire must be tended. One inattentive servant and the heat disappears, leaving the stone to reclaim its chill, and with it comes the rats, the fleas, and the certainty that warmth is temporary. Dogs are everywhere. They are not only guards and hunting companions, they are living heaters. A nobleman might have 2 or 3 hounds curled at the foot of his bed. Children nestle beside them. In some households, dogs are allowed on the mattress itself, especially the small ones bred to sleep beside their owners. Their purpose isn't just affection, they keep your feet from freezing off before dawn. People knew which dogs were best at warming ankles, which ones stayed quiet through the night, and which ones needed to be kicked off after they farted under the covers. Blankets are rarely individual. Families share, servants share, You sleep under the same wool sheet someone else slept under last week or yesterday. Clean bedding is for the sick or the noble. And even then, it's aired more than washed. Furs are precious. Ermine for the nobles. Rabbit or fox for the rest. They trap heat like nothing else but are prone to fleas. Still, no one refuses them. If you're given fur to sleep under, you use it, even if it wriggles a little. Some castles had window shutters, but many didn't. In winter, that meant wind slipped through the cracks, breathing across your neck like a ghost. People stuffed gaps with rags, straw, even moss to block the drafts. In some rooms, the wind still howled. You'd hear it moan down the stairwells, circle around the turrets, and then whistle under the door as if asking to be let in. And sometimes, people did just that, left a door ajar on purpose, not for the wind, but for the dogs, or for someone arriving late, wet and frozen from riding across the moor. The fear of fire was real, so people banked the embers at night, covering them with ash to keep them smoldering. Too much air in the fire might catch the drapes, not enough, and it would go out. The one who managed the fire slept closest to it, not for comfort, but for duty. That person woke, often prodding, adjusting, watching. In winter, this meant the difference between comfort and frostbite. Bathing was rare, and bedclothes carried the scent of weeks, sometimes months, of wear. Perfume sachets helped. People hung herbs from bedposts or tied them into their sheets. Lavender, rosemary, thyme. It didn't cleanse, but it masked. And more importantly, it was believed to ward off illness. The nose was considered a gateway to disease. Bad smells were dangerous, sweet ones, protective. So people literally tried to sleep inside the scent of safety. The noise didn't stop. Even in a castle, someone always stirred. A guard shifting in his armor, a child waking with a cry, the clatter of a drop bucket in the courtyard, owls, rats, the wind. You learned to sleep with it all, to let the noise pass through you like water around a stone. If you woke, you didn't panic. You adjusted, rewrapped your cloak, tucked your feet under the dog, whispered a short prayer, just in case. Those who were truly rich might have a separate chamber, a room within a room. But even there, attendants were nearby. Privacy was partial, and sleep was still unpredictable. If the Lord was ill, the entire household felt it. If there was news of war, no one slept. If the lady was with child, every creak became portent. Bedtime was never just bedtime. It was always the waiting room for news, for danger, for change. Still, there were moments of peace. The fire, low but warm. A dog's steady breathing. The weight of fur across your chest. You might lie awake, listening to the castle's ancient groans. The way the stones shifted slightly as they cooled. You might hear the drip of water somewhere in the walls, or the faint laughter of a guard who thinks no one can hear him. You turn, shift, pull your cloak tighter. The smell of the rushes is earthy and familiar. The cold still leaks through the cracks, but it feels less sharp now. Your body is adjusting, or maybe you've just grown too tired to care. Either way, your thoughts begin to blur again. The fire's glow flickers behind your eyelids, and the castle exhales with you, heavy, ancient, restless, and alive. The hush of the room deepens, and as you slip back towards sleep, your breath slows to match the pulse of the dark. But not everyone lies still. Somewhere in the shadows of this medieval night, a different kind of ritual unfolds, one whispered, brewed, stirred, or softly sung. Because while most people resign themselves to cold and discomfort, others reach for something older. Not spells, exactly. Not science either. Just remedies. Bedtime remedies. The world before sleeping pills was not devoid of sleep aids. It was full of them: tinctures, roots, infusions, prayers, lullabies, charms. The medieval mind, after all, had little faith in the body to sleep on its own. Sleep had to be courted, coaxed, or tricked. And so, around fires and hearths and straw beds, a quiet pharmacy of herbs and rituals unfolded each night, passed from old women to young mothers, from monks to the sick, from memory into motion. Take valerian. You've heard the name, maybe, as a supplement. But in the Middle Ages, valerian root was a go-to herb for the restless. Crushed, boiled, dried, or infused in wine, it smelled like damp socks, but was believed to calm the nerves and ease you into slumber. Mothers hung little pouches of it over their infants' cradles. Soldiers chewed the root before sleep, hoping to push away the echoes of battle. Some women tied a sprig of it to their bedpost, braided into a strand of hair, not for beauty, for silence. It was sleep by scent, by belief, by habit. Then there's lettuce. Yes, lettuce. Not iceberg, imagine that, but darker, heavier leaves, boiled until soft, served warm with oil, and eaten before bed. Physicians believed lettuce cooled the blood, softened the liver, calmed passions. Too much heat in the body, they warned, led to wild dreams and sinful thoughts. So lettuce it was. And if not lettuce, then warm milk steeped with honey and sage, or a slice of bread soaked in broth, or ale diluted with water, called small ale, given to children and the elderly alike to lull them into sleep without the bite of real drink. In monastic infirmaries, the remedies were even more elaborate. Sleep tonics included poppy syrup, brewed carefully so as not to overdose the patient. Recipes were guarded, sometimes written in Latin in the margins of herbals, their measurements as poetic as they were practical. A pinch of nightshade no larger than a friar's thumbnail, or 3 leaves of angelica, bruised under the full moon. Some monks swore by chamomile baths, others by soft chanting. In many abbeys, the last ritual of the day wasn't prayer. It was the distribution of herb-stuffed pillows, lavender, thyme, meadowsweet, carried to the dormitory like holy offerings. But sleep wasn't just about what you took. It was also about what you heard. Lullabies were not only for children. In rural homes, women sang to their husbands after long days in the field. Voice low and slow, melodies passed down through generations. The songs were simple, repetitive, soft, full of earth and sky. Some were prayers disguised as tunes. Others were nonsense rhymes, meant to lull the brain into surrender. A common one in parts of Wales repeated the names of saints in a spiral Dewi. Non, Cadoc, Gwen, Dewi, Non, Cadoc, Gwen, until the singer and listener both drifted off. Even instruments were used. The lyre, the dulcimer, the bone flute, yes. Sometimes actual bone were plucked gently to coax the house to rest. In wealthier homes, hired minstrels played soft airs in the evening. Not performances, not for applause, but for sleep. The nobleman lying in bed, staring at the canopy, listening to notes fade into the timbers above, his wife, eyes closed, one hand on her rosary, the other on the blanket. The song, barely there, like breath. Candles played their part too. People watched the flame until their eyes blurred. Some believed the shape of the melting wax could guide their dreams. Stare until the wick bows. One saying went, and sleep will bow with it. Others used light to banish fear. Children were told that as long as the candle burned, nothing evil could enter. Of course, candles were expensive, so sometimes, instead of real fire, people stared at glowing coals or even imagined flames in the dark. The mind, after all, has always been willing to fill in what the body cannot afford. And then there were charms. Sleep charms stitched into pillows, written on scraps of parchment and placed under mattresses, etched onto headboards by trembling fingers. One popular charm included the Latin words, "In paz dormiam et requiescam." In peace I will sleep and rest. It wasn't just poetry. It was protection. People feared what came during sleep, not just dreams, but spirits, illness, death. A charm was a shield, however thin. In the north, some people believed putting your shoes under the bed facing opposite directions confused evil spirits. In other places, they left bowls of water by the door so spirits would be drawn to their own reflection and forget to enter. Others tucked iron keys under their pillows, or knives, or bone fragments from a saint, stolen or bought, wrapped in cloth and kissed before bed. And still, For all this effort, sleep didn't always come. Restlessness existed. Insomnia had names: night wandering of the mind, moonsick thinking, devil's tossing. People blamed digestion, or melancholy, or witchcraft. A man who woke every hour might be told he had too much wind in the head. A woman who couldn't sleep might be given vinegar to rub on her feet, or placed under observation, in case her sleeplessness was not natural, but caused by envy, lust, or secret sin. There were always those who didn't sleep because they feared what would come. Not dreams, but memories. Men back from war, women widowed by plague, children who had seen too much too young. For them, sleep was not healing. It was a trap. So, they walked the halls, stirred the coals, muttered to themselves. Sometimes these people were pitied, sometimes feared, and sometimes, when they'd gone long enough without rest, they were taken to the edge of the village and left to let the stars decide. Yet, most people eventually slept. The warmth of a shared blanket, the whisper of time under the chin, the soft drip of water down the gutter. It worked. Not every night, not perfectly, but enough. Because the truth is, people didn't expect perfect sleep. They expected tired sleep, earned sleep. They lay down after bending their bodies all day, farming, walking, praying, stitching, kneeling, and let the ache carry them under. You feel that now? The weight of your limbs, the dull rhythm behind your eyes. Maybe you smell lavender. Maybe you don't. Maybe someone just hummed in their sleep beside you, or maybe you imagined it. Either way, it comforts you. The idea that someone centuries ago hummed the same note, chewed the same bitter root, said the same odd prayer and drifted, just like you will, soon. You stir again, not from dreams, but from the racket beneath the floorboards. Someone is shouting in slurred syllables. A pig squeals indignantly, and a lute string snaps with theatrical finality. Welcome to the joy of sleeping in a medieval inn. You're above the tavern. If you're lucky, if you're unlucky, you're in the tavern, curled under a table sticky with spilled mead, snoring beside a cart driver who smells like turnips and wet dog. Either way, you're not getting peace. The bed, if there is one, creaks like a ship about to sink. The straw smells like sweat and spilled ale, and the walls made of hope and wishful thinking. Every sound finds you. The inn is full tonight. Merchants, pilgrims, farmers, thieves, a night or two, and the innkeeper's 17 cousins, and every one of them has decided not to sleep yet. The inns of the Middle Ages were nothing like the quaint, fire-lit resting places you might imagine from fairy tales. They were rowdy, chaotic, and necessary. Travel was slow and dangerous. You couldn't just ride through the night, not without risking your purse or your life. So when you reached a town, you looked for a roof, and that roof was often attached to a tavern, food, drink, sleep all crammed under one groaning ceiling. The common room served many purposes: dining hall, courtroom, dance floor, and bedchamber. It was not unusual to fall asleep while someone played the lute, and someone else bartered for chickens 3 feet from your head. And the noise, oh, the noise. Inns were alive at night. The fire never went out. The ale never stopped flowing. The dogs barked. The minstrels plucked their instruments until the strings broke, or someone threw a shoe. If you were on the second floor, assuming the place had one, you were spared the elbows and spilled stew, but not the sound. The floorboards were thin. Every cheer, burp, or sudden brawl rose upward like smoke. You learned to sleep through it, or you didn't sleep at all. Beds were scarce. You didn't rent a room. You rented space. A sliver of a mattress, or maybe just a spot on the floor. The wealthier might get an actual bed with a straw mattress and a wool blanket, but even that came shared. A merchant with silver to spare might pay extra to not have to spoon with a stranger, but most accepted bed sharing is part of the deal. There are records of innkeepers squeezing 6 people into a bed, head to foot, and charging each one a fraction of the price. You slept, curled, careful not to breathe too loudly. You didn't make eye contact in the morning. Sanitation was a rumor. Chamber pots were passed around or ignored entirely. Some patrons stumbled outside to relieve themselves in the alley, returning with the smell of night and regret clinging to their boots. Others didn't make it outside. The rushes on the floor weren't just for decoration. They soaked up more than spilled ale, and you, half asleep, nose pressed to your bundled cloak, pretended not to notice. The food edible, sometimes a thick stew that tasted mostly of onion and mystery meat, bread hard enough to chip a tooth, ale that foamed like a dying dog, but at least dulled the noise. You ate fast, if at all, and tried to secure a sleeping spot before the drunkest guest passed out in them first. There were no reservations, no lists, just opportunity. You claimed a corner like a soldier claims ground, set your pack down, and tried to look unbothered by the pig under the next table. And yet, despite all this, people returned, because there was something comforting in the noise, in the mess, in the chaos. Traveling alone through dense woods and bandit-ridden roads made the racket of a crowded inn feel oddly safe. As long as the fire was lit and the music played, you weren't alone. Even if the man beside you snored like a demon, at least he wasn't trying to rob you. Probably. Inns were hubs of information. Gossip flowed faster than the ale. Who had been arrested in the next town over? Which baron had fallen ill? Which roads were flooded or cursed? You learned more at the hearth than in any church. Stories passed between mouths like steam, some true, some embellished, all entertaining. A traveler who couldn't sleep might sit by the embers, cup in hand, and listen to a tale of haunted bridges, treacherous wives, or talking cows until the fire died, or the storyteller passed out mid-sentence. And let's not forget the animals. Inns were for them, too. Horses were stabled nearby, chickens clucked under the table, dogs roamed freely, licking dropped food, growling at drunkards, and occasionally curling up with guests who radiated body heat. If you slept on the floor, you might find a goat sharing your blanket. You didn't complain. The goat was warmer than the blanket. Sometimes fights broke out. Cards turned to curses, curses to fists. Tankards were thrown, someone lost a tooth, sometimes an eye. But by morning, it was all forgotten. Bruises turned to jokes. Enemies turned to drinking partners. The innkeeper shouted at no one in particular while sweeping the rushes, and the cycle began again. Night blurred into morning like the end of a long, strange dream. Some travelers swore by specific inns. The noisy one near the river, they'd say, but they serve good stew. Or, the one with the cats in the rafters. Or, the one where that blind minstrel sings about ghosts until dawn. These places earned reputations, some infamous, some legendary. A few were even recorded in medieval travelogues as excellent for a warm fire and questionable company. The beds themselves were rarely worth remembering. Sacks of straw, sometimes moldy, sometimes fresh, blankets stiff with use, pillows, if they existed, smelled of every traveler before you. Some guests brought their own bedding, rolled tight and worn thin, but most accepted what was given or what they could take without protest. And in the rare moment when the tavern grew quiet, when the lute was silent, the fire low, and even the drunks passed out, you could almost hear your own thoughts. You lay there, surrounded by snoring bodies and sleeping dogs, and feel the odd hum of a world still spinning. The night might be loud, filthy, and crowded, but it was also alive, a living organism of breath and noise and heat. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, the man next to you shifts, mumbles something about debt or pigs, a rat skitters along the rafters, someone downstairs begins to sing again, off-key and alone. You know the chorus. It's one of those songs that never ends, only slows. You close your eyes, not to block it out, but to join it. And just before you drift off, you realize this, too, is sleep. Not clean, not peaceful, but real. Sleep shaped by clamor, by laughter, by tired feet and shared walls. In a world without silence, you don't wait for quiet. You fall asleep in the middle of everything and let the world keep turning. The night feels heavier now, not with darkness, but with questions. A rustle beside you, the creak of a floorboard that may not be from the wind. And suddenly, You remember stories you didn't ask to remember, tales muttered by firelight or whispered when someone woke screaming. Because sometimes people didn't sleep well, sometimes they didn't sleep right, and in the Middle Ages, when a person rose from bed and wandered the house at night, eyes open but mind absent, no one called it sleepwalking. They called it something else, something unnatural, maybe cursed, maybe touched, maybe dangerous. Sleepwalking wasn't just a curiosity, it was a warning, a sign. The sleeper who didn't sleep, the dreamer who moved, the body awake while the soul was elsewhere. And people feared it with the kind of unease you feel when you see something that shouldn't be moving, but is. The term sleepwalker as we know it didn't exist in the way we use it now. Medieval people had other names: the wandering one, the moon haunted, the borrowed soul. Some said the body was being used by something else, a spirit, an angel, a demon. Others thought it was a form of madness, a temporary affliction brought on by bad humors or cursed dreams. There are records of people being tied to their beds for their own safety, and for the safety of others. A baker's apprentice in 1321 walked into the river in his sleep and drowned. A noblewoman was found in the kitchen, barefoot, trying to milk a goat that wasn't there. In one town, a boy who walked at night and whispered to himself was taken to the church and forced to sleep inside a chalk circle for 3 nights, while a priest watched for signs of possession. Historians still argue whether these accounts were embellished, misunderstood, or simply accurate reflections of a world that didn't yet have a word for neurology. Sleepwalkers weren't always feared. Some were pitied. If the wanderer was a child, people assumed innocence that their dreams were too full, and their little legs simply followed. Mothers tied bells to their ankles, so they would chime if the child moved. Others sprinkled salt by the threshold to keep the dreamer from crossing. Some households kept a second lock on the inside of the door, not to keep anyone out, but to keep the sleeping from wandering into the cold. But adults who rose from bed and moved as though called, they were different. A sleepwalking adult might be left alone, but never untouched. People watched them warily. If they sat up in bed and spoke in riddles, or stared into corners too long, someone would whisper that their soul had wandered too far. There are letters from abbots requesting guidance. A brother in our dormitory rises at the hour of the wolf, walks the length of the cloister, and speaks in Latin not taught to him. What are we to make of this? The reply: pray, do not follow him. There were theories, of course. Some said the moon was to blame, that its light stirred the waters of the brain, much like it moved the tides. A full moon was feared not just for wolves, but for wanderers. Others believed dreams were simply too strong, too loud, and they pushed the body from stillness. That dreamers chased what they saw: a lost love, a dead sibling, a voice in the trees. There's a story from Bohemia about a man who walked to his sister's grave each night, barefoot in the snow, and never remembered it come morning. He died when someone locked the church gate. He froze there, kneeling. The villagers called it tragic. Some called it holy. But not all stories ended quietly. In parts of Germany, there were trials, yes, trials for those who committed crimes while sleepwalking. Theft, assault, even murder. Some claimed it wasn't them, that they were dreaming, that they woke with blood on their hands but no memory of violence. And sometimes they were believed. Other times, they were hanged anyway, because the idea of a body that couldn't be trusted terrified people, not just because it broke the law, but because it broke the rules of nature. What good were locks, prayers, rituals, if sleep itself could become corrupted? In popular belief, sleepwalkers were often caught between worlds. Some said their souls had not returned properly from dream. Others said they were trapped by spirits used like puppets for ghostly errands. That's why, in some regions, people were forbidden from waking a sleepwalker. You'll break their soul, the old women said. You'll crack their mind like an egg. Instead, they would gently guide them back to bed, placing lavender under their pillow, whispering their name 3 times. Others sprinkled blessed water behind them, not in front, lest the spirits see, and if the walker resisted, they were sometimes held down, quietly, with crossed fingers. And then there were the witches, always the witches. If a woman was known to wander at night, especially during certain phases of the moon, or after the death of a child, It raised suspicion. Was she communing with something? Was she being summoned? Sleepwalking could become evidence, part of a larger pattern used to accuse. She walks at night, someone might say, and the cows dry up when she passes. That was enough. Testimonies in witch trials often mention strange night behavior, not only flying or cackling, but simple things being seen outside at night in her shift, barefoot, staring at the sky. No explanation was safe. Despite all the fear, there were those who saw mystery instead of menace. A few physicians speculated that the mind, when dreaming, retained partial control over the limbs, that sleep and wakefulness weren't opposites, but points on a wheel, that the soul could swim in both waters at once. These ideas weren't mainstream, but they floated in texts, occasionally surfacing among monks who'd seen too much to dismiss what they couldn't explain. They called it somnambulismus, a word born of Latin, meaning sleepwalking. It appeared rarely, but when it did, it was written in the same tone used for eclipse, or miracle, or curse. What's strange is how the same body that was feared at night was welcomed by day. The sleepwalker who caused unease in the dark might be a respected neighbor in sunlight, and so people learned to keep secrets. Families didn't speak of their night walkers. They told visitors, "She sleeps like stone." They made sure no one saw the child tied gently to the bedpost. They moved silently through morning routines, pretending not to notice the scratches on the floor or the shoes left near the open door. You shift now, awake, but still heavy. You remember your own dreams of rivers, of bells, of hands you couldn't see. You wonder what your limbs did while your mind wandered. Did you speak? Did you move? Did someone watch you from the edge of the bed and wonder if you were still yourself? And then you hear it, a creak, the soft hush of bare feet on wood. Someone moving, slowly, deliberately, not sneaking, just searching. You don't call out. You don't reach. You simply close your eyes and let them pass. Because here, in this time, in this night, you know better. Some sleepers are best left to their sleep. The footsteps fade, and you sink again into your straw-filled mattress, shifting just enough to avoid the sharp spot you already know is there. But now your mind is too awake to sleep. Your eyes remain closed, but your thoughts begin to wander, tugged by the curious memory of what people used to keep at their bedsides. Not love letters, not scented candles, but objects that made little sense until you understood what they feared, what they needed, and what they couldn't name aloud. Because in the Middle Ages, the space beside your bed wasn't just storage. It was sacred, defensive, and deeply revealing. It told a story of class, of belief, of discomfort, of superstition, and of survival. The things people kept near them at night said everything about how they understood the dark and what they thought might be coming for them in it. Start with a knife. It's one of the most common objects kept within arm's reach, especially in rural homes and among travelers. Not a dagger for dueling, but a small utility blade, often wooden-handled, used for cutting bread, cord, or intruders. Most people didn't feel entirely safe, even behind locked doors. There were too many threats: animals, thieves, soldiers, even neighbors with old grudges. So the knife slept near the pillow, sometimes under it, or tucked into a shoe placed at the foot of the bed. There are stories of people waking to the sound of breaking wood and rising instantly, blade already in hand. It wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. Then there were the charms less sharp, but equally important. Tiny bags sewn from scrap cloth, filled with dried herbs, pressed flowers, or even fragments of bone. Some were stitched shut by candlelight, their contents never spoken aloud. Lavender to soothe the breath, rue to keep away sickness, rosemary to protect against nightmares. The bags were placed under pillows, hung from bedposts, or tied around wrists. Children slept with them like talismans. Lovers exchanged them like vows. And when someone died in the night, their charm was burned or buried with them, just in case whatever it protected against wasn't finished. Some people kept saints' relics nearby, tiny splinters of wood said to be from the true cross. or bits of cloth once touched to the bones of martyrs. These were rare and precious, often wrapped in wax cloth and kept in a small wooden box on a stool beside the bed. If the relic was especially powerful, it might be placed inside the mattress itself, sewn beneath the top layer so it pressed against the sleeper's body like an invisible shield. Relics weren't decoration. They were boundary lines between this world and whatever waited in the next. And for those who lived in fear of sudden death or demon dreams, that line needed guarding. But not all bedside objects were holy. Some were downright strange. In certain regions, people placed wheels of cheese beside their beds, not to eat, not even to bribe mice. The belief was that cheese, in its roundness and stillness, absorbed the chaos of dreams. It acted like a sponge, pulling in wandering spirits, redirecting nightmares into its quiet, solid shape, a cheese that cracked in the night, a sign that it had served its purpose. There's a record from northern England of a woman who replaced her bed cheese every full moon, burying the old one under a hawthorn tree to release the bad dreams trapped inside it. Then there were the objects of necessity, a candle stub, set in a crust of old bread or pressed into a chipped dish, ready to be lit if sickness struck or if childbirth began in the dark, a basin for water, though the water was rarely fresh by morning, a comb or bone-handled brush, used quickly before bed to untangle the day. In noble homes, these items might be made of ivory or glass, polished and delicate. In peasant homes, they were simple, handmade, worn smooth by use, a clay mug for water, a wooden crucifix nailed to the wall, a single sock, repaired too many times, always kept warm and dry in case the other was wet from work. And then, the unexpected, a shoe turned upside down, placed precisely under the left leg of the bed. Why? To confuse spirits, or to trap witches, or to balance energy. No one quite agreed, but people did it, and when asked, they just said, it's safer that way. In one case, a merchant recorded placing a live toad in a small box beside his bed to absorb illness. The toad died. The man lived. Coincidence or cure? The box remained. Women sometimes kept personal items, clothes, not jewelry, but cloth soaked in rose water, used to calm the mind or cleanse the hands before evening prayer. Some tied strands of their children's hair into small knots and tucked them beneath their pillows, believing it kept the child safe at night, wherever they slept. A midwife might sleep with a coil of thread wrapped around a stone, ready to use in an emergency birth. A shepherd might sleep with a bell from his lead sheep, just to hear it chime in dreams. And not everything by the bed was chosen. Sometimes it just ended up there. A clove of garlic rolled from a cooking pouch, a piece of bread too stale to chew but too precious to discard, a button, a coin, a note. Small things collected in the folds of sleep and kept as if they meant something. Maybe they did, in a world where so little could be controlled. The clutter beside your bed was a small constellation of your needs, your fears, and your stories. In monasteries, the nightstand, if it existed, was kept sparse. A book of hours, a wooden cross, a bowl for washing, but even monks weren't immune to keeping things close. One abbot confessed, in a rare surviving letter, that he kept a stone his mother gave him as a boy tucked into the hem of his sleeping robe. It presses against my hip as I sleep, he wrote, and I remember the shape of her voice. And of course, there was the bed itself. Some carved secret symbols into the post initials, crosses, even astrological signs, marks made with a knife, hidden beneath drapes or behind the headboard, visible only to the sleeper. Others kept coins tucked between the ropes and mattress, for luck or for the ferryman, depending on how the day had gone. In some noble households, the under mattress space became storage letters, deeds, love notes, keys, because nothing was more private than the place you lay helpless. You reach now toward the edge of your own imagined sleeping space and wonder what's there. A knife, a crumb of cheese, a forgotten prayer. You are surrounded by shadows, but you don't feel afraid, not exactly. Just aware. Aware that for hundreds of years, people feared the same dark, breathed the same cold, and kept the same odd treasures by their beds. Maybe they believed too much, or maybe we believed too little. Either way, You turn onto your side. Something shifts beneath the blanket, just a wrinkle, just a memory. You exhale. You're still here. The night hasn't taken you yet. And the objects beside you, whatever they are, keep their silent watch. You lie still, nestled into the hush that follows so many centuries of forgotten sleep. But as the quiet deepens, a different question begins to form, not about the body, or the blanket, or even the bed itself, but about the strange world behind your eyelids. Because in the medieval mind, sleep was never just a pause, it was a crossing. And dreams weren't dismissed as nonsense. They were studied, feared, envied, recorded, even punished. The question wasn't whether dreams meant something. It was whether you had the wisdom or divine permission to understand what they were trying to say. You weren't the only one watching your dreams. Your priest, your doctor, your neighbors, they all had opinions. Did you dream of water? That meant change. Of blood, sin, of flying pride, of falling temptation. Dreams were maps of the soul's journey by night, and in the Middle Ages, getting lost in one could ruin your life by morning. There was no uniform doctrine about what dreams were. That was part of the problem. Some thought dreams were divine messages, gifts from angels, or warnings from saints. Others were sure they came from demons, placed there to tempt or mislead. And still others, the medical types, blamed digestion, the balance of humors, or sleeping on the wrong side. All three views lived side by side in the same towns, the same households. You could be told on Sunday that your dream of fire was holy, and by Wednesday, the same dream could be used against you in court. Historians still debate how much the average person believed in the symbolic value of dreams versus how much they feared the reaction to them. But in any case, dreams weren't private. They leaked, they echoed, they had consequences. There are entire books from the Middle Ages dedicated to interpreting dreams called somnia. They catalog symbols with clinical precision. A wolf means betrayal. A storm means political unrest. A tooth falling out means the death of a relative. These guides were often copied by hand and passed between clergy, healers, and occasionally noble women who wanted to understand the strange visions that came between matins and dawn. In some households, dreams were discussed each morning. Almost like whether I dreamed of fish, someone would say, and the others would murmur, "Be careful near water today." In noble courts, dreams were sometimes recorded by scribes, especially if the dreamer was important. A king's nightmare could send a bishop into days of fasting, just to be sure nothing was coming. And people took it seriously. A woman in York reportedly dreamed of a crow pecking her wedding ring and woke convinced her marriage was cursed. Within the month, her husband fell from a cart and broke his leg. That was enough. She filed for annulment, citing divine warning. The bishop denied her petition, but the story traveled. People remembered. Another tale tells of a peasant who dreamed of a hidden coin buried beneath a tree. He found it, exactly as seen, and used the money to buy 2 goats. One of them gave birth to twins. A miracle, they said, or witchcraft. It depended who you asked. But not all dreams brought fortune. Some were trials. To dream of fire and not be burned meant you had passed a test. To dream of speaking with the dead meant you had been chosen, though, for what? No one could say. A girl in Brittany claimed she dreamed every night of walking through a garden where a man in white showed her letters she could not read. She couldn't write. She couldn't even speak Latin. And yet, she described the letters in enough detail that the local abbot took notice. He brought in scholars. They tested her, declared the dream true. She was placed under protection, trained to read, and later joined a convent. Her dreams never stopped. But some people lied about their dreams. They claimed visions they never had, either to gain attention or to escape punishment. A servant caught stealing claimed she had dreamed of the Virgin Mary telling her to take the bread as an act of charity. She was beaten anyway, but her defense was noted. Later, a neighbor tried the same excuse, but with apples. The villagers laughed. The Virgin, they said, didn't care about apples. The church tried to draw a line. Only some dreams were valid. Only some dreamers were trustworthy. Saints, mystics, holy men. Everyone else was watched. The line was blurry. A poor woman dreaming of fire might be blessed. A wealthy widow dreaming of flying might be accused of vanity. A man dreaming of wolves might be considered cursed or a prophet. It depended not just on the dream, but on the dreamer's place in the world, and on who was listening. And sometimes, people feared dreams not for what they meant, but for what they did. There were rumors of men who died in their sleep from visions too vivid to bear, of women who woke blind after dreaming of lightning, of children who screamed through the night, unable to say what they had seen, and never spoke again. These stories aren't proven, but they're repeated, and in repeating, they became warnings. To protect themselves, people practiced dream rituals. Some slept with iron near the bed to anchor the soul. Others drank calming herbs or avoided meat before bed, believing animal blood made dreams violent. A few carried small books of psalms and opened them at random each night, interpreting the first line as the dream of the soul. If it said something ominous, they slept sitting up or not at all. Not everyone feared dreams. Some pursued them. Monks kept journals, recording every image in detail. A king's astrologer might spend hours decoding the previous night's symbolism before the council could meet. A merchant might change his route after dreaming of a black dog on a broken bridge. It wasn't superstition, it was pattern recognition, medieval style. You couldn't afford to ignore messages from your own mind, not when disease, war, and starvation lurked behind every sunrise. Dreams could also be political. A queen who dreamed of her husband dying might gain sympathy or suspicion. A bishop who dreamed of God's judgment might call for reforms. A nobleman who dreamed of rebellion might begin to suspect his own servants. Dreaming wasn't innocent. It was surveillance, with the dreamer under observation by others, by heaven, and sometimes by their own conscience. And still, people dreamed of rivers, of animals, of hands reaching from smoke, of gardens and ghosts in cities made of glass. Some dreams were nonsense, some were prophecy, some were memories distorted into new shapes, and some, of course, were never told at all. You lie there now, caught between sleep and morning, wondering what your own dream will be. You think of the candle stub by the bed, the thread tied around your wrist, the whispers someone spoke hours ago that you didn't understand. Will your dream be peaceful? A simple walk in the woods, or something stranger? Will you remember it when you wake, or only the feeling it left behind? You don't know. You only know this in the Middle Ages. Dreams weren't a place you escaped to. They were a place you risked going, every night. You breathe more slowly now, sinking further into that dim cocoon where sound has no edges, and thoughts lose their names. But still, the quiet stirs with one last question. How did the people of the Middle Ages end their nights? Not how they fell asleep, but what they did just before. In those final, fragile moments when the fire burned low, and the night was no longer waiting. It had already arrived. Because in a time when the next breath was never guaranteed, the final act of the day mattered. Bedtime wasn't just sleep, it was preparation for absence. The last hour of the day could be a rehearsal for death or a ritual of hope, or sometimes both. In wealthier homes, a servant might enter with a small brazier, gently warming the sheets with glowing embers scooped from the hearth. You hear the soft clink of metal against tile, the brief hiss as heat meets fabric, then silence as the servant bows and slips away, leaving you in flickering shadows. This act wasn't just comfort, it was status. Fire was precious, and warmth was not wasted on those without name. In the poorer homes, children might be wrapped together under one wool blanket, their feet tangled, breath rising in slow rhythm, learning to be still. Some nights the only warmth came from each other, and if someone coughed too much or whimpered in their sleep, there were glances in the dark, silent, uneasy. For everyone, rich or poor, the moment before sleep often involved prayer, but this wasn't always the formal, echoing Latin of cathedral mass. It was softer, muttered, personal, a line from a psalm, a gesture traced on the chest. God keep me this night. Christ guard my soul. May angels surround this bed. Some prayers were ancient, passed down unchanged. Others were improvised, shaped by fear or fatigue. A merchant about to travel might ask for strong legs. A mother might whisper her children's names. A widow might speak to no one at all. And for those too tired to speak, there were objects to hold: a carved cross, a smooth stone, a piece of cloth from a dead lover's shirt. These things didn't protect in any provable way, but they anchored. And in a world that constantly tilted between plague, famine, war, and superstition, anything that felt solid was treated like a treasure. Then came the listening. You don't notice it at first, but once the fire dims, your ears begin searching for creaks, for the rustle of thatch, for a horse's distant snort or the strange whine of wind against wooden shutters. Some sounds meant nothing, others were warnings. A howl too close, a cough that didn't stop, the scurry of mice too bold to wait for full dark. In some homes, a dog lay at the foot of the bed, twitching in sleep, ears alert. In others, a candle was left burning just long enough to blur the line between safety and sleep. The idea of protection didn't end with locking doors or saying prayers. Some families placed bowls of clean water near the entrance or windows not for washing, but to trap spirits, which were thought to pause and look into their reflections. Others drew symbols in chalk near their bed frames, crosses, circles, or even the name Jesus in Latin, scratched backward to confuse demons. Not everyone believed these things worked, but few dared sleep without them. Children, especially, had bedtime rituals shaped by fear and repetition. A child who saw a ghost once might be told to sleep with salt under their pillow. Another might be taught to recite a nonsense rhyme that, when said backward, would keep witches away. Whether these worked was beside the point. They gave the child something to do, and in a world where so little could be controlled, doing something was its own kind of peace. Sometimes the final hour before sleep was spent in silence, but shared. Couples might lie facing the ceiling, not touching, not speaking, just listening to the fire crackle or the wind shift outside. Friends might sleep side by side on pallets of straw, heads nearly touching, each pretending not to snore. In monasteries, entire dormitories of monks fell asleep together, the room dim and silent except for the rhythmic breathing of men who had vowed to surrender every part of themselves, even sleep, to something higher. But surrender didn't always mean peace. Night was not just the absence of light, it was a kind of exposure. Without the distractions of work, noise, and daylight, everything unspoken had more room to breathe. Grief that had been suppressed during the day returned after sundown, when no one was watching. Regret, desire, fear, all sharpened in the dark. You could not light enough candles to banish what lived inside your own memory. And yet, somehow, sleep still came. Not always easily, not always without interruption, but it came slowly, as it comes to you now. A yawn escapes. You remember how villagers used to cover their mouths when they yawned, not out of politeness, but because they feared the soul might escape. So many customs like that, tiny reflexes rooted in forgotten fears. You almost chuckle, then drift, because despite everything, they slept, through wars, through winters, through illnesses they could not name. They curled beneath blankets, pressed close to the ones they loved, or reached out for comfort in the absence of company. You might think they were naive, that their prayers in salt bowls and backwards chalk were foolish, but maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it isn't about whether these things worked. Maybe it's about how they tried, how, even in the face of endless uncertainty, they created rituals of safety and rhythm to protect the most vulnerable hour of the human day. And what was that final moment? Truly, not just the body collapsing into stillness, but the spirit agreeing to return, to trust that morning would come, that the rooster would crow, that the fire would still be smoldering, that someone would stir the porridge and sweep the floor and pull open the shutters to let in light. Sleep was a faith act, every single night. So as you lie there now, in your own soft world, surrounded by pillows and silence, maybe you carry a few of their customs with you. Maybe not the chalk symbols or relics, but something, a way of folding the blanket, a phrase muttered without thinking, a strange superstition you picked up and never questioned, a favorite side to sleep on, a story you return to. And now, the wind down comes. The sounds are muffled, the breath slows, the candle of the mind grows smaller. You float now, no longer bound by the shape of your day. The world softens, edges blur, and the body, once alert and watchful, melts into the weightless dark. Whatever waits beyond this sleep, You're not alone. You're carried by 1,000 years of dreamers who came before you, who whispered their prayers into the dark, tucked their knives and charms beneath their pillows, and gave themselves to the night without knowing whether they'd wake. But they did, and so will you. Sleep gently. Sleep deeply. The past is watching over you.